Okay.
Can I start with a question, or are you going to tell me what this is about?
You can start if you want.
Well, I would like to hear from you your understanding of the assignment.
Okay. Well, I'm supposed to interview you about your experience with living in the 1960s in this city in Berkeley, and just let you tell me anything interesting or helpful that I can learn from.
Okay. Is there, could you say a little bit about what you are interested in about the 1960s? Or Berkeley? Or both?
I want to know about what people were like, about other races, here, minorities, how they talked and how they dressed, and their religions and the culture, basically.
Okay. Well, you have given me some questions. Do you want to ask these questions? And I'll see if I can say some things about them.
Okay. So, the first one. When did you live and what was your life like before you moved to Berkeley? How old were you when you arrived in Berkeley, and why did you come here?
Okay. Well, I came to Berkeley when I was 28 years old. And before that, I lived with Joy, with your grandma, and your dad, and your Uncle David. We're little boys, and we lived in New Haven, Connecticut, where I was a student at Yale University. And we came in the summer of 1967 to live in Berkeley. And why did we come here? As part of the question. Well, I came to take a job teaching in Berkeley, to teach at a seminary and at the Graduate Theological Union, which was brand new. And so we came here for that purpose, to live in Berkeley, and so I could teach.
Okay. What differences did you notice when you arrived?
Differences from where I lived before? Yeah. Well, when we arrived, we were in what we used to call cultural shock. Life was so different here in Berkeley from back east in New England town where I lived. There was so much activity going on the streets, and in just about everywhere there was a tremendous variety of people and cultures. Life was very informal. There was a lot of public activity going on around politics and social issues and cultural kinds of things. A sense of change, drastic change that people were expressing in American life. There were a lot of people who sort of lived on the streets, not always just on the streets, but they were known as hippies. People dressed very casually. Long hair was coming into style for men, for example, for women too, real long hair. And a not too good thing was happening, and that was the taking of drugs, like marijuana, but mostly what was known as LSD, drugs that turned out to be rather dangerous for people. There was kind of a free-for-all atmosphere. And then finally, underlying all of this was sort of political rebellion and demonstrations against the war in Vietnam that had started up by the time we arrived. So those are some of the things. It was very, very wild and kind of everybody doing your own thing. That was one of the expressions that they used.
What do you think was behind the changes in society that were occurring?
Well, that's a very good question and a very complex kind of question, because it would be, the causes would have to be rooted back into the years before the 60s began and in the early 60s. I think that there was a movement primarily among younger people, college-age people, and even in high school by the time we had arrived, against all kinds of traditional rules of conformity in life. And it was conformity to ideas of what it meant to be a patriotic American, ideas of conformity about how you were supposed to dress, and the roles of people, the limitations of roles of people, like the roles of women. And those were some of the things that developed into what became known as counterculture. Those who were trying to express new and different ways from the ways that they've been taught to conform to life before. That underlying all of this also was the civil rights movement that had been led by Dr. Martin Luther King. And that, on the one hand, and the war in Vietnam, which was becoming very unpopular war, and young people were rebelling very much against the war, the drafting people into fighting into the army and so on. And they opposed the government and they opposed the war. And these two things, the fact of the war and the civil rights movement, I think were more than anything finally behind what was changing in society.
Okay. Can you tell me about protests that you witnessed on the Berkeley campus, and what were people protesting about and why?
Well, I can. I saw so many of these. When I first came, they were reaching their height, and so it was almost a daily experience for me, because my office was right across the street from the People's Park, which was a big gathering place for students and other people who were protesting. I've already said what they were protesting about. Mostly they were protesting about the war and the government's involvement in Vietnam and the escalating of the war and the drafting of young people into fighting a war they didn't want. And so they would protest against this, and they would have public burning of draft cards, and they would have huge rallies that sometimes would get violent, and so there were always police around, and there would be enormous crowds who would gather and hear speeches at Sproul Plaza, for example, and almost daily, certainly weekly, there would be these things. Sometimes they got violent, and there were actually some deaths that happened. But it was more than just the war. It was these other things as well. The university had already been the place earlier in the 60s, before we came, of the protests for free speech on the campus, that students would have a right to speak out politically on political matters and social issues. And they had huge protests about this, and so it was in the light of these protests and in the context of these protests that Berkeley had become a central place in the whole country, really, on college campuses, of protest movement. They were protesting for more freedoms, and more freedoms in the university for students, but also for freedoms in society. And